Good morning, Kirk. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Sheldon, and how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. We have this weird thing going on right now. The sun is out
Mm-hmm.
and it's actually heating up the outside. So normally in the winter here, the sun comes through our triple pane windows and heats up the house, and it's nice and warm, but it doesn't actually heat up the outside. It's going to hit like 20 some degrees today.
Oh, wow. I can hardly wait till we see a day like that here. I think we're supposed to get that later on in the week.
Yeah. I actually brought out the patio furniture yesterday and it's all set up. I was out there this morning. It was only like +5, so I had a blanket on, but the sun was there. I had to wear sunglasses. Amazing. It's we don't get a lot of it, but like the 5 months or whatever of beautiful sun and stuff is just great. I love it.
Well, I was out yesterday spraying my apple trees for the first time ever, and apparently there are 2 different sets of instructions. There's the set of instructions for mixing the 2 bottles of concentrate,
Mm-hmm.
and then hidden behind a label is the set of instructions of what to do with the mix. I didn't see those second sets, so I just took the 2 bottles of concentrate 2 to 1. I thought, wow, this is weird. I would have expected some dilution here, but nope. In they go into the bottle, slosh around, root mix really good. And so I had enough. So I did 2 apple trees with pure concentrate, which normally would do 30 trees. So I've been checking.
Those apples are going to be like the size of watermelons.
Well, they're for pesticide, eh?
Oh,
so
okay.
I'm just hoping the apple tree survives.
Oh.
I thought of hosing them down with water, but I thought, well, I'll check the budding leaves first. If they show signs of distress, then I'll hose her down with water.
Mm-hmm.
But so far, they're just outside my window here. So far, it looks like it might be all right. Maybe. We'll see.
Well, I'm assuming there won't be pests within about 6 miles of those trees just from the smell.
Absolutely, because I was spraying this stuff on with a bumper spray, and I thought, wow, this is powerful stuff. Like anything downwind is going to get. And just to wash my hands afterwards, I washed and rewashed, and I didn't really get any on my hands. It was just and I was not standing downwind either, so it was very powerful. I think I may have fixed the neighbor's apple trees while I was at it.
Okay, the EPA is now going to be at your door in the next couple minutes here from yikes. In instructions. That's awesome stuff.
Yeah, 2 sets, 2 different sets, 2 different places. Well done.
Yeah, you need to jump online and send in a form on their website. Yikes. Man. So so spring's here. Birds woke me up this morning at 6. That was amazing. Not as amazing as I would have liked to have been woken up at 8 or 7 at least. Those early birds wanted the worm, I guess.
Yeah.
And so what else? What's been going on your side of the lakes from here?
Well, not much other than the grass is growing like crazy, and I just got about 5 minutes into mowing it when the lawnmower broke down. So I've been waiting days, like 6 days for parts. Meanwhile, the grass is getting really high, and we're having people over this weekend. So I don't know what to do. Probably get a baler in and bale the hay after I mow the lawn.
And goats aren't an option.
They're too much trouble.
Too much trouble. Yeah. They're cute though. The baby ones are really cute.
Mm-hmm. That's the mistake people make.
That's in general.
With dogs, cats, goats.
Yeah, what could go wrong? Oh man, our dog. We were ready to give him away. He woke me up the other night by I think it was. Well, no, the first time was midnight. He had to go outside, and I'm like, okay, I'll let him out. And so he takes a couple steps off the deck onto the grass and just.
Oh.
plastic. He had eaten farmer sausage wrapper.
Oh no! Good thing he threw it up.
We're glad he threw it up.
Yeah.
And but then he's like, "Oh, I should eat this."
Oh no! They do things like that.
Yeah. So I'm like running outside. I'm not wearing a whole lot because it's midnight, and so grab it with my bare hands just so he couldn't get it again. And
Oh no!
oh,
Yeah. Well, sometime I'll have to tell you my dog in the tent story when he started whining.
oh, no.
We'll talk about that in another time when there's a bit more time.
In a tent. Yikes.
Yeah, if your dog starts whining in the tent, get it out. Don't ignore it.
No. Good to know. Good to know. All right. So for those of you who are watching, today's stream is on the, I guess, concept or philosophy of legislating morality and how much should Christians be engaged in the sort of trying to get Christian beliefs, Christian views into the law, to basically have the rest of the nation, the province, or state, whatever where you're in, how much should Christians be involved in that idea? And it's something I've been thinking about a long time because similar to the freedom of speech conversation we had last week, I think it's a tendency to want to, okay, this is what my beliefs are, whatever they are. And I want others to do the same thing. Now, Kirk, I know we had a little bit of prep time on this. You had brought up some Bible verses in terms of what the government's role is according to Scripture. So why don't we start there? What is the government's role according to the Bible?
Well, okay. There's a little quote from Romans chapter 13 where he specifically talks about our relationship with the government and what God expects the government to do. And he says, it's a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. And here's the key part. For it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So my takeaway from that is that from God's perspective, the central role of government is to basically punish evil. And so that's God's expectations. Now in history and life, there is a problem. And the problem is, number one, what happens if the government becomes corrupt? Problem number two, what happens?
That would never happen, Kirk. It would never happen.
What happens if the population, becomes corrupt? When I say corrupt, I'm talking about in relation to what's evil and what's good. So as a civilization becomes increasingly corrupt, God says it tends to say that what is evil is actually good and what is good is actually evil. And we're seeing that in today's civilization, our society. So traditional Judeo-Christian morality, for example, is some aspects now are seen by our culture as evil. Other aspects that once were evil under Judeo-Christian moral principles are now regarded as a right, a legislated right, a judicial, granted by our government and our judiciary. So that's where things get complicated, because then the government's no longer enforcing or punishing, and I quote here, bringing wrath on the one who practices evil. They end up actually bringing wrath on the one who practices good. But there's another complication, and that's what if the population itself is not interested in, Judeo-Christian moral principles or what the government says. And that complicates things further. Now, up until a couple of years ago, I used to think that basically the government follows the population, like at least in a democracy. So the population decides, what do we like? And, this one here matches most closely to what we want. therefore we'll vote this government in, and the government therefore feels obligated to continue to do polls to see what the population wants so that they can continue offering them that. And so if the population goes corrupt, if they deviate from God's moral principles, then the government tends to go that road. And if they try to legislate, let's say, traditional morality, because traditional morality actually, and that's a vague term, but we're going to talk about traditional morality in many different cultures, not just Judeo-Christian cultures, is not that far off. There's quite a bit of overlap, a huge overlap with what we would call Judeo-Christian morality. So traditional morality is a larger umbrella term, but if the government insists on legislating traditional morality and the population doesn't like it, they get turfed. They'll turf the government. That's what I used to think. And that's partly true still, I believe. But what I saw in the last 2 years is that, and with the government and the media, is that there's a much higher percentage of people in our society who can be influenced by the government and the media. So that if they had no position, or even if they were slightly against something, if the government and the media begins to promote a message, I was surprised. I was really actually shocked that how many people are actually influenced by that. They don't necessarily think through things critically. It's just this daily onslaught of propaganda, government positions, media, and so forth that just seem to change the minds of the general population. I suppose, like, I read about it back in the Cold War, how they would arrest certain people, and part of the brainwashing that would go on was to subject the prisoners every day to education times, where they would
re-education camps,
re-educate people by constantly repeating things. And, I knew that this seemed to work, but I thought it would only work under duress, under like being in jail and being subject to this day after day, food deprivation. But no, it actually works for the general population when they're not actually all that deprived. So here's the conundrum we find ourselves in. The government does seem, from what we read here, to have a moral responsibility, or a God expected responsibility, to legislate according to what's right and wrong, and punish those people who do wrong. And if they do that, it will influence a substantial chunk of the population. That's on the one side. On the other side, if the population in general is really going down a different road, they resent the government. They'll not elect them next time, and they'll just go their own route anyways. In other words, we see two things happening here. There's intrinsic motivation and there's extrinsic motivation. The government can provide extrinsic pressure, even coercion. But if you really want to see change, it really ought to happen from the inside, intrinsically. And if the government coerces, and it's not a good society to live in when a government increases the number of laws, increases the penalties, maybe even brings in an emergency act or whatever to enforce its will on the people, or its version of events on the people. It's not the greatest situation, but if the general population intrinsically wants to do things the right way, that's a whole better program to run on. And when we look at Jesus Christ and what he modeled when he was here, there were plenty of things to protest. For example, Roman colonialism. They were under the heel of the Roman Empire. Human rights abuses like whippings and floggings to the point where people would die, crucifixions. And it wasn't just on Easter. Jesus and the two thieves weren't the only people crucified. This was common practice in the Roman world for crucifixion. And they would hang them up along the road, and the shield your children's eyes as you walk by. So there's human rights abuses, there's slavery. There was plenty of things, plenty of issues here. So what did Jesus do? The leaders wanted, or the general population wanted him to make the government, wanted him to take over basically, but it wasn't his time yet to do that. Instead, everything he focused on had to do with intrinsic change, the relationship of the person with God. And when that happens, then something else spreads throughout society like yeast throughout dough. And you actually begin to see a more powerful, positive change rather than trying to make the government, enforce extrinsic motivation to do what's right.
So when I think of Romans, so Paul's writing this letter to this church, and he makes these statements about the role of government. And my guess is that was not something he was expecting to see in his lifetime, was that the government of that time would be doing this. Like it would be a miracle to have governments doing what he is suggesting in Romans that they would be doing. Am I right in saying that?
I guess it depends how much evil we want government to address. If we just want them to address, let's say, murder and stealing, well, most governments address that, and no matter how corrupt they are, or how far away they are, or how atheistic they are, they still have laws against murder and stealing. Although in the Roe versus Wade thing, that gets a little blurry there because of things which are highly controversial at the moment. Yeah. But for, let's say, pornography, I know that the laws have changed huge on that since, in the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. And this is where the issue was first raised to me of should the government legislate morality, and it was back on the porn thing back around in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And it was a person in my class suggested that the government should not be making laws against pornography, and simply because that's a moral issue and government cannot legislate morality. So that is actually a question. What do we mean when we say, should the government legislate morality? That's different, I think, than should the government pass laws against bad behavior. But in general, as you point out here, Sheldon, is that God has an idea of what's evil and what's right and wrong. And that will not happen until God himself rules, because that would be a miracle. There have been brief times in history you have some pretty good governments. But in general, and specifically towards the end of history, God said it's just going to get really bad. In fact, government will enforce evil almost completely at the expense of everything that is right and good.
So Jesus spent a lot of time being upset at the leaders of that day. But it wasn't the government. It was the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders of the day that he spent the majority of his anger at. It was very, very directed at those people. And they were the people that ended up requesting that the Romans put him to death. But why wasn't it so important for Jesus to worry about those leaders instead of the Romans, who were actually the ones in control?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. And I suspect, just off the top of my head here, is because he was focusing on the religious leaders' hypocrisy. You see, it was the hypocrisy of the religious leaders colors and taints the idea of God. In fact, other places in the Bible, God talks about these leaders as profaning his name, the name of God. And so if the solution, if the perfect solution to evil is actually intrinsic change within a person, when they put their faith in God or in Jesus Christ to make that change, then religious hypocrisy is actually a major threat, a major problem, a stumbling block, an obstacle in many people's minds. And it is to this day. I mean, I hear so many objections about religious hypocrites. That's one objection to Christianity, but another problem is what we might call culture-led Christianity, which is just basically a different kind of God that's been molded to be acceptable. If Jesus were here today, I think he would certainly, I mean, we always think of the legalistic, rule-driven, expectation-driven type of Christian who has lots of rules and regulations, and he would certainly address that. But those I find today are more rare. What is very common are, on the other side, the progressive Christians, the culture-led Christians, where these would be people who are led by culture, and their view of God is led by culture and what culture finds acceptable. And this actually is like a decoy from people actually having a relationship with God, because they can have a form of Christianity that actually is very appealing, because we're all shaped by our culture, but it's not going to lead to a relationship or a Christ-led form of Christianity. So this is why I think back in the day, he hardly said virtually anything about the Romans who were in power and committing all this colonialism, slavery, human rights, atrocities, virtually nothing about that, and a ton about the religious hypocrites who had this religion that did not lead to a relationship and intrinsic change within the individual. And I think that's why, because intrinsic change is the most important thing if we want to see change. And the religious hypocrites are one of the major obstacles to that prevent people from going the real road.
For those of you who are watching, feel free, drop a question or comment in the chat. We probably aren't going to deal specifically with the things like Roe versus Wade and individual type good versus evil questions. Like if you're asking, is this evil? Is this good? I don't know if we're going to be dealing directly with those kind of things, just because YouTube will block us and we'll lose our websites and all that stuff. But what we're getting at here is the actual philosophy and the principles behind where Christians should be focusing their energy. And when I think of the disciples they wanted Jesus to come in, be the king, take over. It wasn't even that they wanted him to totally destroy Romans. It was more, we just want our country back, and we want our own king. We want to, and so the disciples are wanting that. The people of the time are wanting that. Jesus comes as the King of the Jews, but not the way they expected. And he always talked about his kingdom and the kingdom of heaven. Is that going to be a democracy?
No, it'll be a theocracy for sure. And but in the meantime, we're stuck with human governments here. And I'll say a couple of things about that. Number one, there are politicians that I greatly respect who actually want to do the right thing. And I support those. So with this description of government, given in Romans 13 to, basically uphold or be an avenger of wrath on those who practice evil, when I see an election time coming, first of all, I pray for the return of Jesus Christ. I mean, that's the only thing.
That's a much better election day scenario.
I do. But in the meantime, I look at the candidates and I look at the parties, and I know what God says the role of government is to be an avenger, basically to enforce, to punish those who do evil, to have some sort of system of laws of what's right and wrong, and those who mess up, punish those guys. So I'll look at the different candidates and different parties, and I will vote for the one that is perhaps most closely aligned with what I think is right and wrong. But the problem is that in real life, any given party has issues. I mean, it depends. And then you're left with prioritizing. Like, I think innocent human life is very important, but what about corruption in the government? And what about some of these other things with regard to sexuality and so forth? See, I see things from a short term and what the immediate consequences are. But some of these things that look relatively harmless in the short term can produce massive devastation in the long term. And that's where J.D. Unnan's work on the role of how he showed how from history, from 86 cultures, how if a culture loosens up their sexual morality, it always leads to a collapse of that civilization within 3 generations, no exceptions. It's irreversible. And what a collapse looks like, well, in the short term, loosening up sexual restraint might seem like a good idea, but long term, it can lead to the death of, in today's culture, the death of many tens of millions or even hundreds of millions when you have a collapse of the civilization. So back to government, I don't think we'll ever see, well, I know we will never see a perfect government, and not even close. I pray for the return of Christ, and my voting is becoming very complicated because of there's no perfect party. And this one here emphasizes that one emphasizes this. And I'm left, well, which is of this pile of evil over here, and this pile with they're mixed in with some good, and this pile of evil over here with their good, and it's not the same. Which one am I going to vote for? And it's not easy. That's part of my responsibility. I also think we have a responsibility to speak up in what way we can when we see injustice happening. Like, for example, let's take the residential schools. Maybe people didn't know, the average person out on the street didn't know what was going on, maybe. But there were people who maybe did know what was going on. And, I would say a Christian has a moral obligation to speak up. Anytime you see a government run injustice, you need to speak up.
And not just government run.
Any kind of injustice.
Kind of injustice.
Yeah. But there's another additional problem, and this is brought out by the book called Who Really Cares by Arthur Brooks. I was just looking at the title down here. He felt when he started doing his research, he thought he was under the impression that the more liberal side of our culture is the one who is really doing something about injustice. But because they lobby the government, they're always protesting and lobbying the government and pressuring the government to fix this injustice over here or that inequity over there. But what he found is that the more conservative part of the population, on average, roughly does twice as much when it comes to actually devoting their time, their hours of the week to injustice, their finances twice as much, even things like donating blood. So basically speaking up and doing something about injustice, or not doing something, that there's a difference there. Speaking up about injustice and doing something about it. And speaking up, there's a lot of that goes on, but when you actually examine what are they actually doing, not a lot. Whereas Christ is more concerned about how you yourself are doing intrinsically, first of all, between you and God, which then gives you the power to do something about what's going on around you, to actually get out and do something, crack your wallet open, that sort of thing, to actually do something rather than just simply lobby the government.
Yeah. And when I think of the solutions that are usually, if millions and millions and millions of dollars are spent to lobby the government to do, put a law in place to have some sort of moral code that people have to follow. We haven't changed anybody's mind. We haven't changed anybody's heart or attitude towards it. We've just put a punishment in place for somebody to break it. But the other thing is they usually don't solve the problem.
Yeah, well, it's true.
It's usually just some way of uh, putting more power structure in place that will end up usually with a lot of unintended consequences that now it's hard to fix because you've got a bureaucracy that's now in the way. And so when I think of legislating morality, it's often that okay, what do you do to actually solve the problem? Because having a few more government workers that are making decisions usually isn't. I can't actually think of a thing that's been put in place that's actually solved the problem that they say. And then the issue is, oh, we just need more money. We just need more money. We just need more money. And at the end of the day, you haven't changed anybody's heart. You haven't changed anybody's mind.
One of the problems, well, there's two that come to mind. You've really highlighted one of the problems, and that's intrinsic change. And so a friend of mine who is a police officer retired after 30 years of work, and he said when he retired, he had to enforce 3 times as many laws as he had to enforce 30 years ago. And so what the government will tend to do is that they in order to punish whatever they think is evil, if the people don't change, then they have to introduce more laws. And of course, the people are creative, so they figure out ways around those laws, loopholes, and so forth. So then they pass more laws to plug those loopholes and those gaps over there. And then people become even more creative and figure out new ways. So then they pass even more laws. And this is why, in general, as a population drifts away from faith in God, they drift toward faith in government. And with that comes the obligation the government feels then is to make people behave. And so you will have, on the one hand, 2 laws given by God: love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and love your neighbors yourself. But then the government tries to flesh that out with many hundreds of laws that don't count the first one. So without the work of God in your life, you're going to need intrinsic motivation, and the government will provide that. So that's problem number one, is never-ending increase in laws. And they don't do anything. Like, I'm thinking right now, some of the politicians, one is when it says they're going to ban handguns in Toronto because there are gang members shooting one another. And I'm thinking, well, if there's a demand for, let's say, illegal drugs, we have seen already that there will be creative ways to meet that demand. And it's the same thing here. What the government really needs to do is to change people's hearts. No, that's not the role of government. God never expected government to change people's hearts. That is an intrinsic change that happens in our relationship with God. Because people will, if their hearts aren't changed, they're just going to do what they want to satisfy the demand. Creatively, intellectually, it's just going to happen. The second problem with expecting the government to solve problems of whatever sort is highlighted and illustrated by a news item that was on one of our major news networks several years ago. They were looking at our Medicare system here in Canada, and they said that approximately half of all our federal taxes that we pay to the federal government goes to healthcare. But each level of government has to get paid out of your income tax. So the department that collects the income tax needs to be paid. Then the federal government, the Department of Finance, the Department of Health, and then they give that money to the provinces government, and their provincial government levels need to get paid, the Department of Health, for example, such that they said out of every dollar that you give to the government for Medicare, for medical assistance, medical care, 79 cents goes to paying the various levels of bureaucracy. Only 21 cents gets to the actual clinics and hospitals. So yes, you can look to the government to solve our problems, but it'll involve 2 things. Number one is a massive increase in laws. Number 2, is a horrendous, inefficient use of the money that working people will earn in their own, trying to provide livings for their families. And that's why often people think that organizations that are funded by people that are more conservative are so flush with cash. They aren't really. Like, I don't know of any, but the appearance is there. It's simply because when you make a donation to, let's say, a Christian charity, whatever, a good one, well, typically it's the opposite. You'll see about 85% of your dollar go actually to what needs to be gone to, and maybe like 14% or 15 going just to support the overhead, the office rentals and machines, equipment, that sort of thing.
And if it's not working, it won't get donations and it'll get shut down, and something else will come up that will hopefully do something better.
Yeah, and hopefully the people will be looking at how well their money is being spent, which unfortunately they don't. I know some charities out there that it's like 85% overhead and a wee tiny bit. And there's some very well-known ones, which I won't name because I don't have the actual, I'm not up on the stats right now before I stick my neck out.
I just want to respond. Peppa said in the comments about specific, as I said, about the specific things and getting kicked off YouTube and stuff. It's, we also have some other issues in terms of our charitable license and stuff that in Canada, we cannot get involved in specific political conversations. So there's also the charity piece that we're dealing with here. But I don't actually think the issue is specifically abortion or anything like that, because it's the heart issue that is the point of this conversation, because the government never changes the heart, or if it does, it's usually not towards God. So I want to take a look back and actually get to maybe it's a question of philosophy that drives a lot of the conversation around things like humanity's role in the world, those kind of things. But are humans good or are they evil? What's our line there? Because if government's not involved and there are no rules put in place, do humans do the right thing? Or do we need somebody to control us in that way?
Well, I know it's politically incorrect to say that humans are anything but intrinsically good. I know it's politically incorrect to say that, but the fact of the matter is that if you just take a look around, we have a problem called human nature. Humans have a serious problem. And that serious problem is our own human nature. So there's one or two ways to handle that. One is intrinsic change. The other is extrinsic enforcement. And so the government's role is extrinsic enforcement. And they are supposed to do things like protect the innocent, for example. That's what they're supposed to do. But I've noticed in the recent conversations this week online, or not conversation, news reports, that the demonstrations, the protests, and I look at this and I see two groups that are worlds apart. And I look at the one group and I say, I don't even understand how they can take their position. There's a fundamental problem with humanity if one endorses, let's say, the taking of innocent life, a fundamental issue, and it's not going to be solved by government. There's some deeper, serious problem here. And I can only see an intrinsic change there. And the problem is our human nature. Basically, it's our human nature it just goes downhill. Like the Bible says, our original nature, or the way we're born, is in a state of corruption. And corruption means it gets worse and worse. And so if we have different roles. So a politician or a judge or person in the media, they're in a position to say, here's what, maybe provide some extrinsic motivation. or enforcement when it comes to the government on what's right. But at the end of the day, for myself, I can only say the way I change personally is God working in my heart. And that's so we have different jobs in this world. And I think the first and foremost priority a Christian has is summed up in maybe like this. It is to prepare to meet God and help others do the same. That's our first and foremost priority. Prepare to meet God, basically, is to focus on loving God with all our heart, soul, and mind and strength the way he meant us to love him. And out of that comes the power to then begin to love our neighbor. And secondly, yes, the what's called the Great Commission. Jesus said, make disciples of all the nations, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. So when we look at the life of Christ and what sort of culture he lived in and what sort of government was in place at the time, we say, well, how did he occupy his time? Where was his priorities? And his priorities was always on the intrinsic change that comes by putting our faith and love in Jesus Christ. That is his first and foremost. Then different believers here in this world will have different specific roles to play when it comes to government, for example, when it comes to the judicial system and so forth. And even if you've got a job in the media, arguing, and you can write, and some Christians will be gifted in their communication ability who are not in those things, but still be able to articulately argue in the public square for a particular area of righteousness or what's right and what's wrong. But the bulk of us, what happens is that the bulk of us, I think, get waylaid and distracted from our mission, our specific mission. So I think each person, what's my specific mission here? It may or may not include, speaking up, lobbying the government, becoming a member of parliament or whatever. May or may not be that. But once you know what your specific mission is, and it's always within a larger context of preparing to meet God and help others do the same, then we have to be careful not to become distracted from our specific mission. So I have enormous temptations to get involved in. When I was younger, I did a lot of letter writing to MPs and took part in various protests. But I don't have the energy to actually do both that and my mission. Not me personally. There's emotional energy that one needs if you're really going to get involved and do something in those areas. I have to therefore focus on my God-given mission, make sure I don't get distracted from it, because it's very easy. Just this morning, I saw a Facebook post and I got to say something about this. I got to say something. And I knew that if I say something, because of whose page it's on, I'll be in a big fight. Let's put it that way. It'll probably go on for days. It'll be a big fight. And then later on, I said no. And then later on, about half an hour later, I thought, I got to say something. And then no, I have to choose my battles. As a Christian, I have to choose my battles. Now, I think I will say something, but it'll be to that person personally, not on Facebook. I'll just have a private discussion with this person so it doesn't become a big fight out in public. And it had to do more with cultural Christianity, progressive Christianity. So we all have to make sure we never get distracted from our primary mission, which will be slightly different for each person, but it'll be under the overall objective of preparing to meet God and helping others do the same.
So Peppa asked, isn't it about protecting innocence and not changing hearts? And I think that is sort of, when you boil it down, that's where we're at, is the idea to protect innocence, which in a way, yes, I understand what you're saying, but there really isn't anything in terms of innocence when we're talking about Earth, humanity. The idea of young children Totally. I understand where you're coming from there, and heaven's there. My question is more, is the battle with the government to make the law change, which may or may not actually change anybody's behavior. It would just potentially drive it underground. Or is the idea of, I've seen a lot of comments about, okay, is the pro-life movement really pro-life when once the baby's born, they don't care anymore? Which is a bit of a straw man's argument. But what is, like, if Jesus was here today, I don't see him on the front lines of a specific issue like that. I see him as the one that's calling people to himself and saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent, change your hearts, and come to me because I am love. I love you. I died for you. And then the change happens. In Romans, talks about the renewal of the mind. It gets into the change there instead of asking people to be perfect before they come to him. Am I wrong?
It's seldom the case that one is completely right or completely wrong about anything.
So half and half?
No, it's complicated. For example, I think God's expectation, if we just talk about innocence in terms of what's generally understood in the law, God's expectation is the government does protect the innocent. They should be not permitting the termination of innocent human life. That is God's expectation of government. But the interesting thing is that God actually does not give. He gives tons of instructions in the New Testament about how we ought to live our Christian life, how we should change, but he doesn't actually flesh this out as to. It says the government is the minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath, but he doesn't flesh out, well, so what are we supposed to do about that? He doesn't tell us what we're supposed to do about that. And the focus seems to be more on ourselves personally. So I think the government...
Is that different than the Old Testament?
In the Old Testament, well, it started off as pretty much a theocracy until they decided they want a king. But then the kings came along. And you see good kings and bad kings. But when I think of today's governments, how are we going to change the government? So there's different methods. You can bring pressure on the government, you can vote, you can have protests or whatever. Those are all ways that have maybe some influence on the government. But we forget that there's another way to change the thinking of the government. And that's through what Christ can do within the population, within the individual's hearts. And when you see a massive spiritual awakening within the population, those people then become, well, that's part of the government too. So the actual thinking of the government and its ability to be an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil, then moves more into line with what is really evil and what is really right. So the government does have an obligation, a moral obligation from God to protect innocent life. But at the same time, how do we change that? And there's different ways. And I think we underestimate as Christians the power of asking God for a massive spiritual awakening in our culture, including the government. In fact, there is one thing God does tell us we can do about changing the government or directing. He says he wants us to pray for those in authority.
Now, he sets up those in authority, including the ones...
He sets them up, he takes them down, and that's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, because if God's setting people up, I used to think in my young naivety that therefore they should all be good, but no. You look at the Bible and you'll find that he'll give kind of government that the population deserves. not just out of spite, but to discipline the population or to allow the population to experience the consequences of where they're going, to reach such a low point that you do have a spiritual renewal or awakening. But he does give us a tool. So I would say the Christians' number one focus, if you want to see the government change, is to pray for the government. And I actually think we need to think about this, because when you are praying for the government, you're asking God to now act in the hearts of the individual people within that government. And it's not just the government. I pray for the Supreme Court. Individual members of the Supreme Court, you're asking God to work within. God has access to the hearts of our governing authorities that no one on earth has. People I know often will respond in stubbornness and resist pressure, like our politicians will resist a protest sometimes. But in reality, God has access, and they don't even realize that. So the power of a Christian praying for the Supreme Court, and I also pray for the media. The media is in massive need of God working in the hearts of the leaders and within our media. So we really, I think, badly underestimate when we take the one most obvious way that God says we can change government, which is by praying for those in authority, and yet probably spend very little time doing that. And instead, we'll much rather go out there and protest or write a letter. And these aren't necessarily wrong things. I have been involved in protests and writing to my MPs myself, but eventually I guess I just began to ask, I always got responses just basically telling me the government's position. I already know the government's position. That's the problem. But I believe that if we actually took God seriously and prayed for our governing authorities, that is the most powerful way to see a government then move more into line with creating the kind of laws that actually protect the innocent and upheld what's truly right and punish what's truly wrong. But that requires an in-person change of the heart, which God can do.
So Brittany said, I think seeking the good of my neighbor includes preventing hurt that could happen when people live in their depravity. Law can help us with this. And I think that's what Romans is saying is, yeah, if the government is putting laws into place that prevent evil from happening, yes, that's correct. But it still doesn't change the heart. So in eternity and in you can have a society that is acting good. They're acting they're not stealing things. It's a nice gated community. They're preventing any evil from coming in. They have their HOA and their blinds are all correct and all of that. But they're still not following God. So how do you focus energy towards helping people experience who Jesus is?
I think like as Brittany said, I do agree that the role of government, and we see that in Romans, is to stop hurting those people because of the depravity of, let's say, the government or the society at large. But as you say, how do we see the government do that when they're going in the wrong direction? Government is like, it's not like an individual where you can have a chat over coffee and sometimes see a big change and then things straighten out. Government's like a massive freight train or an oil tanker ship or an iceberg it might move slow, but it has enormous momentum. And how can we ensure that the government is actually going to protect the innocent life and to stop the immoral, like say sexual immorality and everything else that we think is key to a fine, moral, upstanding life? And there again, that's the issue. That's the issue. How can we see that happen? And Christ seemed to focus on the intrinsic change that was required. And the New Testament commands us to pray for those in authority. Now, I know I see it online a lot of people just sneering at prayer, like, oh yeah, get down on your knees and pray. You might as well be picking your nose for all the good it's going to do the government. But I guess that's the difference between a person, let's say a follower of Christ, who actually believes that when they pray, they're talking to God and not. So I do think that God has given us two powerful things to change government. One is, right now you can change it by praying. Number two, takes a little bit longer, but it changes it by a spiritual awakening within that society. And I think most Christians don't believe that, actually. I mean, they'll assent to that, but when I look at how they live their lives, they don't believe that prayer really does a whole lot of good when it comes to changing the mind of the Supreme Court or whatever. And as far as changing the hearts of the individual in our society, I would say most Christians are not very involved at all in sharing their faith with friends and coworkers in a way that, is culturally relevant and appropriate. My observations. There may be pockets where that's more common than others. Canada's pretty secular, so there's lots of opportunity for trying to be salt and light in this world. But I guess the question we got to ask ourselves as Christians, do I actually believe that a spiritual awakening in my country could change the course of government, the Supreme Court, and the media? Do I actually believe that? Secondly, am I actually honoring Christ's command to pray for those in authority?
One more comment and then we'll end for today. And those of you who are watching after, feel free to send in your comments. And if you head to kirkdurston.com, you can send in private messages if you don't want your name out there. So Peppa just posted, the body of the church should change hearts. Yes, the government should protect the innocent. It should. The U.S. Republican states' rights government is based on verses from Genesis. The state's decisions will bear fruit. Yes, if you go back, a lot of that, there's some Christian Judeo values in the United States Constitution and stuff for sure. Even as a Canadian, I look at the U.S. setup the way it should be working, as the checks and balances are great if they worked, but as it's been stated, you need virtue, and if there's no virtue, it doesn't matter all the checks and balances; they're just not going to work because you lose the foundation of morality in that. And I think you would probably agree, Peppa. There's so much corruption in, I would say, both of our governments right now that I think it's lost its way.
I should point out here that Peppa mentions the state's decision will bear fruit. I think he or she is talking about individual states in the U.S. that have actually passed laws to protect the innocent. Mm-hmm. And in that case, you have levels of government that are actually involved in this on taking different sides. And I think that's good. I think that what these states have done is that's the arena. It's the government, this branch of government saying, no, this is wrong, versus that branch of government which is not standing up for what's right. And that's the context. I think God actually designs government this is a good thing, that some states are, I think, closer to representing God's righteousness than others. I think mainly our discussion is, what does the individual do? And that includes voting for the right people. It includes praying. It may include speaking up in the media in an appropriate way. Like, one of the unfortunate things I'm seeing, I took a course once. It was actually just a one-day thing by a psychologist who was telling teaching us a day-long seminar on how to deal with angry people. And with angry people, you never make a statement. You never make assertions because they're just not hearing what you say. Rather, you ask questions and you seek to build bridges with that person. And you want that other person on the other side of the fence to see that you actually understand their position and they feel hurt. And then you're in a more of a position that they will hear what you have to say if it's done in a gracious way. But one of the also issues we're facing right now is this polarization, this absolute, I see photographs, I see videos of two groups shouting at each other. This is, there's got to be a better way, got to be a better way. And I think individually, we need to think very carefully. And here's one of my operating principles I try and apply to my own discussions on these things. God says, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. He's actually telling us how to have interactions here. And it has to be with grace, which seasons what we say with salt. In other words, we have to be able to engage people from the other side of the fence in such a way that we can actually build bridges and do that. So what I'm saying is we need to avoid spreading more hate, burning bridges, yelling at one another. This is exactly what we see Jesus not doing. He did not do those things. Somehow, and this is a lifelong process for me, lifelong, and I've got so much to learn, but somehow we need to interact with society and the individuals the way Jesus interacted with his society and the individuals, somehow.
Now, he flipped tables. He was not impressed in certain cases, but again, it wasn't with the Romans.
That was with the religious hypocrites. Now, I do think that there is some extra, like he was God. He is God. So when God walks into his Father's house and he sees that kind of corruption, it was actually a foreshadowing of what's going to happen at the end of history. And but when he tells us to let our speech be seasoned with grace, walking in and flipping tables and making a whip of cords and whatever, there's some things that I think Jesus did as God. That would be one of them, that I'm not sure we're in a position to do as human beings, unless we're actually in a position of authority. We see evil happening and we have the backing of that position of authority to move in. And as Romans chapter 13 says, be an avenger, bringing wrath on the one who practices evil. But unfortunately, I say unfortunately, that's the government's role here. They need to step in. But I am not in a position to flip tables.
All right. Well, we're going to end it here for today. We won't be on next Thursday, but we will be back the Thursday after. I hope you have a great day. Leave your comments, like, subscribe, hit the bell if you want to be notified when we're doing new things. And I know, Kirk, you're doing some more reaction videos coming up and stuff too. So we will see you in a couple weeks live, but I'm sure some stuff will appear in the meantime.
And my thanks also to those who posted comments. Yep. I think that really helps focus the conversation on the areas that you're interested in. Yep. See you in 2 weeks' time, I guess.
Bye-bye.
Bye.